The slave markets of Zarian Prime buzzed with activity as alien traders examined their newest shipments. Among the cages filled with various species stood a small human girl, no more than 16 standard years old. Her brown hair hung in tangled waves around her pale face, and her green eyes darted nervously between the towering alien forms that passed by her cage. Sarah Chun had been captured during the raid on Colony 7. She remembered the screams, the burning buildings, and the massive ships that blotted out the sun. Now she was just another piece of merchandise in the galactic slave trade, waiting for someone to buy her. The Vorthek Empire controlled this sector of space with an iron fist. Their reptilian forms and advanced technology made them the dominant force across 17 star systems. Emperor Zaktar ruled from his throne world with absolute power, and his military commanders were known throughout the galaxy for their brutality. Commotion near the main platform caught everyone's attention. The crowd of alien traders quickly moved aside as heavy footsteps echoed across the market floor. Sarah pressed herself against the back of her cage as she saw who was approaching. General Krathver, known as the Emperor's Wolf, stood nearly 8 feet tall. His scales were darker than most Vorthek, almost black, with scars crisscrossing his massive frame. Red eyes scanned the merchandise with cold calculation. This was the being who had conquered 12 worlds for the Empire. Stories of his victories were told in whispers across the galaxy. The slave trader, a thin Zelkari with 4 arms, bowed deeply as Krathver approached. General, what an honor. I have excellent specimens today. Perhaps a strong Gorian for heavy labor? Or maybe a clever Nexari for technical work? Krathver's gaze swept across the cages without interest. His reputation demanded only the finest warriors for his personal guard. Weak species were beneath his notice. But then his eyes stopped on Sarah's cage. What is that small creature? His voice rumbled like distant thunder. The trader looked confused. Oh, that? Just a human female. Hardly worth your attention, General. Very fragile species. No combat ability. I was thinking of selling her for domestic work. Krathver moved closer to Sarah's cage. She tried to make herself smaller, but there was nowhere to hide. The General's red eyes studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She had heard stories about what happened to humans who caught the attention of high-ranking Vorthek. Humans, Krathver mused. I have heard whispers about this species. They come from a death world, yet appear so weak. Exactly why they're not suitable for your needs, General, the trader said quickly. No natural weapons, no armor, no enhanced strength. They're really quite pathetic. Sarah's fear began to mix with anger. Pathetic? Her people had fought bravely during the raid. Captain Morrison had taken down 3 Vorthek warriors before falling. Lieutenant Garcia had held the evacuation point until the last civilian escaped. They weren't pathetic. How much? Krathver asked suddenly. The trader's 4 eyes widened. General, surely you're not serious? This creature would be useless to you. I have much better options. I asked for a price. The temperature in Krathver's voice dropped several degrees. For 50 credits, General. But really, I must insist. Krathver tossed a credit chip to the trader without taking his eyes off Sarah. Open the cage. With trembling hands, the trader activated the lock. The energy field that had kept Sarah trapped flickered and died. She remained pressed against the back wall, knowing that running would be pointless and probably fatal. Come here. Human, Krathver commanded. Sarah's legs felt like water, but she forced herself to stand. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something other than walk toward this monster. But she had seen what happened to slaves who disobeyed. Slowly, she stepped out of the cage. Krathver towered over her, his massive form blocking out the artificial lights of the market. Other traders and customers had stopped their business to watch this strange scene. The great General Krathver buying a weak human slave. It would be talked about for months. Look at me, Krathver ordered. Sarah raised her eyes to meet his red gaze. She expected to see cruelty, hunger, or the cold calculation she had witnessed in other Vorthek. Instead, she found something she couldn't quite identify. Curiosity, interest. It didn't make sense. What is your name, human? Sarah, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Louder. Sarah Chun, she said, forcing her voice to carry despite her fear. Crathford nodded slowly. You will come with me, Sarah Chun? You are my property now? The words hit her like a physical blow. Property. After 16 years of freedom on Colony 7, she was now someone's possession. But she had learned that showing weakness in this place only invited more pain. I understand, she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. Something flickered across Crathford's scarred features. Surprise? Respect? It was gone too quickly for Sarah to be sure. He turned and began walking toward the market exit, his heavy footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Follow, he commanded without looking back. Sarah hurried to keep up with his long strides. Behind her, she could hear the confused murmurs of the crowd. The Emperor's Wolf had just bought a human slave for no apparent reason. Speculation would run wild. As they left the slave market, Sarah caught a glimpse of Crathford's ship waiting on the landing pad. It was a massive warship, black as space itself, with weapon arrays that could reduce a city to ash. The sight of it reminded her that she was now in the hands of one of the most feared military commanders in the galaxy. But as they walked toward the ship, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She might be a slave now, but she was still human. Her species had survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and the dangers of a death world. She would not break easily. She had no idea that this moment would change not just her life, but the fate of the entire Vorthak Empire. The fragile human girl walking behind the Emperor's most savage Wolf carried something within her that neither of them yet understood, something that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization itself. The interior of Crathford's flagship was as intimidating as its exterior. Dark metal corridors stretched in all directions, lit by strips of red lighting that cast everything in an ominous glow. The air thrummed with the power of massive engines, and Sarah could feel the subtle vibration of the ships. Weapon systems charging, Vorthak crew members stopped what they were doing to stare as their general walked past with a small human slave trailing behind him. Their reptilian faces showed confusion and barely concealed contempt. Sarah kept her eyes down, trying to ignore their hostile stares. Crathford led her through a maze of corridors until they reached his personal quarters. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a spartanly furnished chamber dominated by a large desk covered in tactical displays. Maps of star systems glowed in holographic detail, showing troop movements and supply lines across the Empire's territory. Stand there, Crathford commanded, pointing to a spot near the wall. Do not move unless I give you permission. Sarah positioned herself where he indicated, keeping her hands clasped in front of her. She watched as Crathford removed his ceremonial armor, revealing the network of scars that covered his massive frame. Each mark told a story of battle, victory, and survival. For several hours, Crathford worked at his desk, reviewing reports and issuing orders to his subordinates through his communication system. Sarah remained motionless, her legs beginning to ache from standing in one position. But she had learned quickly that questioning orders led to punishment. As the ship's artificial day cycle shifted to night mode, Crathford finally acknowledged her presence again. You may sit, he said without looking up from his work. Sarah gratefully lowered herself to the floor, grateful for any relief. She had expected to be assigned to menial labor or worse. The fact that Crathford seemed content to simply have her stand in his quarters was puzzling. Tell me about your world, Crathford said suddenly. The request caught Sarah off guard. General? Your colony. Tell me about it. Sarah hesitated. Was this some kind of test? Was he gathering intelligence about human settlements? But refusing to answer would certainly be worse than complying. Colony 7 was a farming world. She began slowly. We grew food crops that could survive in harsh conditions. The soil was difficult and the weather was unpredictable, but we made it work. How many people? About 50,000. Mostly families from Earth who wanted to start fresh somewhere new. Crathford's red eyes fixed on her. And your family? The question hit harder than any physical blow. Sarah's throat tightened as memories of her parents flooded back. They died in the raid. My father tried to defend our home. My mother was helping evacuate the children when your bombers came. She expected anger at her accusatory tone, but Crathver merely nodded. War is not kind to the innocent. Then why do it? The words slipped out before Sarah could stop them. She immediately regretted her boldness and waited for his wrath, but Crathver tilted his massive head thoughtfully. An interesting question. Most slaves do not ask such things. I'm sorry, General. I didn't mean to. I did not say you should apologize. His voice carried a note of something Sarah hadn't expected. Curiosity? The Empire expands because it must. Weakness invites attack from our enemies. Only through strength can we protect what is ours. But Colony 7 wasn't a threat to anyone. We were farmers. Today's farmers are tomorrow's soldiers. Today's peaceful world is tomorrow's military base for your enemies. Crathver turned back to his displays. This is the reality of galactic politics, human. Your species will learn this truth, as all others have? Sarah wanted to argue, to point out the flaw in his logic, but she bit her tongue. She was beginning to understand that Crathver was more complex than the simple monster she had expected. His brutality seemed to come from a place of calculated pragmatism rather than sadistic pleasure. Over the following days, a strange routine developed. Sarah would stand silently in Crathver's quarters during his working hours, occasionally permitted to sit or rest. He would sometimes ask her questions about human culture, always in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for military briefings. She learned that the ship was traveling to the outer rim of Vorthak territory, where rebel forces had been causing trouble. Crathver was being sent to crush the uprising and restore imperial order. Sarah also began to notice details about the general that surprised her. Despite his fearsome reputation, Crathver treated his crew with respect rather than terror. He remembered the names of junior officers, asked about their families, and made decisions that prioritized the lives of his soldiers over quick victories. It didn't match the image of a bloodthirsty monster that imperial propaganda promoted. One evening, as Sarah sat in her usual spot while Crathver reviewed casualty reports, she noticed his mood had darkened. The numbers on his screen showed heavy losses from the previous day's engagement with rebel forces. 17 dead, he muttered, his clawed fingers clenching into fists. For a supply depot of questionable value? Sarah found herself speaking without thinking. I'm sorry. Crathver looked at her sharply. What did you say? I said I'm sorry. For your losses. She met his gaze despite the fear that always lurked in her chest. They were your people. Their deaths matter. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Sarah wondered if she had finally crossed a line that would bring punishment down on her. But Crathver's expression was unreadable. You offer sympathy to an enemy who destroyed your world? You didn't kill them personally. And grief is grief, regardless of species. Something shifted in Crathver's red eyes. For just a moment, the mask of the perfect imperial general slipped, and Sarah saw something underneath. Pain, loss, the weight of command that crushed even the strongest shoulders. Humans, he said softly. Your species continues to surprise me. That night, for the first time since her capture, Sarah was given a proper sleeping area instead of being left to rest on the floor. It was just a simple cot in a storage alcove, but it felt like a luxury after days of sleeping on cold metal dot as she lay in the darkness. Sarah realized that something was changing between her and the fearsome general. She didn't understand what it was yet, but she sensed that her life as a simple slave was about to become much more complicated dot in his own quarters. Crathver stared at the tactical displays showing the next day's planned assault, but his thoughts kept drifting to the small human who had offered him sympathy for fallen soldiers. In his long military career, no one had ever done such a thing. The Empire taught that mercy was weakness, that compassion was a luxury that led to defeat. But as he looked at the casualty projections for tomorrow's battle, Crathver found himself questioning truths he had never doubted before. The fragile human girl was beginning to crack the foundations of everything he believed. The rebel stronghold on Kepler-7 was built into the side of a mountain, its defensive positions carved from solid rock. As Crathver studied the tactical hologram in the ship's war room, surrounded by his senior officers, he could feel the weight of the coming battle. "Direct assault will cost us 2,000 troops minimum," reported Commander Theckenel, his second-in-command. "The rebels have positioned their heavy weapons to create overlapping fields of fire." "Acceptable losses," growled General Vergath, one of the division commanders. "We crush them quickly and move on to the next target. The Emperor expects results, not casualty reports." Sarah stood in her usual position near the wall, invisible to most of the officers but always present during these strategic meetings. Over the past weeks she had begun to understand Vorthak military doctrine. Overwhelming force applied without hesitation. Victory at any cost. Crathver's red eyes studied the hologram, his scarred fingers tracing possible attack routes. "The rebel leader is Jekstar, formerly a colonel in the Imperial Navy. He knows our tactics." "All the more reason to hit hard and fast," Vergath insisted. "Show mercy to traitors and we invite more rebellion." "I am not advocating mercy," Crathver replied coldly. "I am advocating efficiency." As the officers continued their debate, Sarah found herself analyzing the tactical situation from her position against the wall. The defensive layout reminded her of something from Earth's history. The terrain, the positioning, the way the rebels had channeled the approach routes. "General," she said quietly. The room fell silent. Every Vorthak officer turned to stare at the human slave who had dared to speak during a military briefing. Vergath's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm. "This slave interrupts a strategic planning session?" Vergath's voice carried deadly menace. "General, surely you see the need for immediate discipline." Crathver's gaze fixed on Sarah, but his expression was unreadable. "Speak," he commanded. Sarah's mouth went dry under the hostile stares of the assembled officers, but she forced herself to continue. "The defensive layout. It's designed to channel attackers into a kill zone. But there's a weakness. A human child sees what trained military officers do not." Vergath's tone dripped contempt. "General, this is madness." "Continue," Crathver said. Ignoring his subordinate's protests, Sarah stepped closer to the hologram, pointing to a section of the mountainside that appeared solid. "This ridgeline. If you could get a small force above the main defensive positions, you could attack downward into their rear areas. The rebels will have focused their heavy weapons outward, not inward." Commander Theckenel studied the display more closely. "The terrain there is nearly vertical cliff face. No army could scale it." "No army," Sarah agreed. "But a small team of specialists could. My father used to take me rock climbing on Colony 7. The formation here is similar to what we had there. You could use climbing equipment and rappelling gear to enough." Vergath slammed his fist on the table. "General, the slave mocks our professional capabilities. I demand permission to execute her for insubordination." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Sarah realized she had overstepped badly, but it was too late to take back her words. She had seen something in the tactical display that reminded her of home, and her mouth had moved before her brain could stop it. Crathver stood slowly, his massive frame dominating the space. For a moment, Sarah thought he was going to grant Vergath's request. Instead, he moved to the hologram and studied the cliff face Sarah had indicated. "Show me the climbing route you envision," he said quietly. Sarah approached the display with trembling hands, aware that every move could be her last. She traced a path up the cliff face, explaining handholds and anchor points in terms that sounded foreign to the Vorthak officers, but made tactical sense. A team of 20 could reach the top in 6 hours. From there, they could attack the command bunker while the main force engages the outer defenses. It would cut their response time and create chaos in their ranks. The war room remained silent as Crathver processed her suggestions. Finally, he turned to Theckenel. "Assessment?" His second-in-command looked uncomfortable, caught between military logic and social expectations. "The tactical concept has merit, General. But implementing suggestions from a slave would save the lives of Imperial soldiers," Krathver finished. Prepare a climbing team. I want equipment and volunteers ready within the hour. Vergath's face flushed darker green. General, I must protest this irregular. Your protest is noted and dismissed. Krathver's voice carried the authority of absolute command. You will follow orders or be relieved of duty. The officers filed out of the war room, leaving Sarah alone with Krathver. She expected punishment, praise, or some kind of reaction to what had just happened. Instead, he continued studying the tactical display in silence. Why did you speak? He asked finally. Sarah considered lying, claiming she wanted to help the Empire or please her master. But something about Krathver demanded honesty. Because soldiers were going to die unnecessarily? Human soldiers died unnecessarily on Colony 7. It was wrong then, and it would be wrong now. Krathver turned to look at her, his red eyes searching her face. You offer tactical advice to save the lives of your enemies? I offer tactical advice to save lives, period. Your species, Krathver said slowly, does not think like others. The assault on the rebel stronghold began at dawn. Krathver led the climbing team himself, much to the horror of his officers who pointed out that commanding generals did not take such personal risks. Sarah watched from the ship's observation deck as tiny figures rappelled down the cliff face and began their dangerous ascent. The main assault commenced exactly as planned. Rebel weapons opened fire on the approaching Imperial forces, filling the air with energy blasts and projectile rounds. But while their attention was focused on the frontal attack, 20 Vorthek commandos reached the top of the cliff and began their descent into the rear areas. When the command bunker exploded in a brilliant flash of light, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Victory for the Empire meant continuation of the war, but it also meant that fewer soldiers on both sides would die in prolonged fighting. Krathver returned to the ship 12 hours later, his armor scorched but his mission successful. The rebel stronghold had fallen with minimal Imperial casualties. As he entered his quarters, he found Sarah waiting in her usual position. The tactical assessment was accurate, he reported, as if briefing a fellow officer rather than addressing a slave. 17 Imperial dead instead of the projected 2,000. And the rebels? Most surrendered when their command structure collapsed. They will be processed according to Imperial law. Sarah nodded, knowing that processed according to Imperial law meant execution for the leaders and slavery for the rest. But nearly 2,000 Imperial soldiers had gone home to their families instead of dying on a mountainside. You did well today, Krathver said quietly. It was the first time he had ever praised her directly. Sarah felt a strange mix of pride and guilt. She had helped an Imperial general defeat rebels who were fighting for their freedom. Yet she had also prevented unnecessary bloodshed. The moral complexity of her situation was becoming clearer every day. She was a slave, but her master was beginning to value her opinions. She was helping her captors, but she was also saving lives. Nothing was as simple as she had believed. When this journey began, what she didn't know was that news of the human slave who advised. General Krathver was already spreading through Imperial communication networks. And in the highest levels of the Vorthek government, certain individuals were beginning to take notice. The summons from Emperor Zakhtar arrived via priority transmission while Krathver's fleet was returning from their successful campaign. Sarah watched from her position in the general's quarters as his massive frame went rigid upon reading the message. The Emperor wishes to meet with me, Krathver said, his voice carefully neutral. Immediately upon our return to the capital. Sarah had learned enough about Imperial politics to understand what this meant. Successful generals who gained too much attention sometimes found themselves facing unexpected retirement or accidents. The Emperor did not appreciate subordinates who overshadowed him. Will you take me with you? She asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Krathver's red eyes fixed on her with surprise. Why would you wish to accompany me to the Imperial capital? Life there will be far more dangerous than aboard this ship. Sarah considered the question seriously. Life aboard Krathver's flagship had settled into a predictable routine. She was fed regularly, given basic medical care, and rarely faced direct threats to her safety. Going to the capital meant entering the heart of the empire, where humans were seen as exotic curiosities at best and vermin at worst. But over the past months, something had developed between her and the fearsome general. Not friendship exactly, but a form of mutual respect that she had never expected. The thought of being separated from the only person in the galaxy who seemed to see her as more than property filled her with dread. Because wherever else you send me will be worse, she answered. Honestly, Krathver studied her for a long moment. Truth. The Emperor's court is filled with predators who would see a human slave as entertainment. But remaining with me may prove equally dangerous. I understand. 3 days later they arrived at Vorthok Prime, the capital world of the Empire. Sarah pressed her face to the viewport as the massive planet filled the ship's screens. City-sized structures covered the surface like metallic growths, connected by transport tubes that stretched between floating platforms in the atmosphere. The Imperial Palace dominated the primary continent, a structure so vast that it was visible from orbit. Towers reached toward the sky like grasping claws, their surfaces gleaming with decorative armor plating that doubled as defensive systems. Stay close to me at all times, Krathver instructed as they prepared to disembark. Speak only when spoken to directly. And remember that showing weakness here is an invitation to predators. Sarah nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. She had faced Vorthok soldiers and officers, but those were military personnel focused on duty and efficiency. The court would be filled with politicians, nobles, and sycophants whose games she didn't understand. The shuttle that carried them to the planet's surface was luxurious by imperial standards. But Sarah could feel the hostile stares of the other passengers. A human in the imperial capital was an oddity that drew unwanted attention. The palace corridors stretched for miles in every direction, filled with Vorthok nobles in elaborate dress and alien dignitaries from subject species. Sarah stayed close behind Krathver as they navigated the maze of political intrigue, her simple slave clothing marking her as property rather than a person. General Krathver, a silky voice called from behind them. They turned to see Duchess Valthara, one of the Emperor's inner circle, approaching with a predatory smile. Her scales were polished to a mirror shine, and her ornate clothing screamed wealth and status. Duchess, Krathver replied with a formal bow that revealed nothing of his thoughts, I trust your campaign was successful? We hear such interesting stories about your methods. Her golden eyes fixed on Sarah with obvious hunger. And this must be the famous human advisor. How exotic. Sarah felt like a piece of meat being evaluated by a butcher. She kept her expression neutral and her eyes downcast, but she could sense the Duchess's predatory interest. The human is my property, Krathver said quietly. She serves my needs adequately. I'm sure she does. The Duchess circled Sarah slowly as if examining merchandise. Such an unusual pet. I've heard she has quite the tactical mind. Perhaps we could arrange a loan? I have some challenges that might benefit from fresh perspective. The suggestion sent ice through Sarah's veins. She had heard whispers about the Duchess's hobbies, none of them pleasant. But she remained silent, knowing that speaking would only make things worse. The human remains with me, Krathver replied firmly. The Emperor has summoned me, and I would not want to keep him waiting. The Duchess's smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened. Of course, General. But perhaps after your audience, we might continue this conversation. They continued through the palace corridors, leaving the Duchess behind. Sarah realized she had been holding her breath and forced herself to breathe normally. She wants to hurt me, Sarah whispered. Yes, Krathver confirmed without looking back. The Duchess collects rare things and enjoys breaking them. You would not survive a week in her care. The throne room was vast enough to house a small city. Pillars carved from single pieces of black stone supported a ceiling that disappeared into shadows high above. The Emperor's throne sat on a raised platform at the far end. A chair carved from the fossilized remains of some ancient creature, Emperor, Zakhtar was smaller than Krathver but radiated an aura of absolute power that made Sarah's skin crawl. His scales were a deep crimson color, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator that had never known defeat. "Ah, my famous general returns," the Emperor said as they approached the throne. His voice echoed in the vast space. "And he brings his pet human. How charming." Krathver dropped to one knee, and Sarah quickly followed his example. The marble floor was cold against her legs, and she could feel the stares of hundreds of courtiers watching from the gallery. "Rise, General. Tell me about this human that has the entire court talking." Krathver stood, his expression carefully neutral. "She has proven useful in tactical situations, Your Majesty. Her perspective offers insights that sometimes escape conventional military thinking." "Indeed? How fascinating." The Emperor's gaze fixed on Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. "Look at me, little human." Sarah raised her eyes to meet the Emperor's stare, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to look away. His red eyes seemed to see straight through her, evaluating her worth like a trader examining livestock. "Tell me, human, what do you think of our empire?" The question was a trap, and Sarah knew it. Any answer could be twisted into treason or insult. But she had learned that honesty was often the safest path when dealing with Vorthic authority. "It is vast and powerful, Your Majesty. But all empires face the same challenge, which is how to rule without destroying what makes conquest worthwhile." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Several courtiers looked shocked that a slave had dared to offer philosophical commentary to the Emperor. But Zakhtar leaned forward with obvious interest. "Explain." Sarah's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to continue. "Conquest brings resources and territory, but ruling requires the consent of the governed. Fear works for a time, but eventually people find ways to resist if they have nothing left to lose." "And what would you suggest, little human?" "Strength when necessary, but also showing subject peoples that they have a stake in the empire's success. Fear keeps them in line, but hope makes them allies." The throne room fell completely silent. Sarah realized she had just offered governance advice to the absolute ruler of the galaxy's most powerful empire. Either he would be intrigued by her boldness or she would be executed for presumption. Emperor Zakhtar stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Then, unexpectedly, he began to laugh. The sound echoed off the stone walls like the roar of some ancient predator. "Fascinating. General Krathver, your pet has quite the mind. I see why the Duchess is so interested in acquiring her." Sarah felt Krathver tense beside her, though his expression remained neutral. "However," the Emperor continued, "I find myself curious about this human's capabilities. General, you will remain at court for the time being. I have some challenges that might benefit from fresh perspective." It wasn't a request. Sarah realized that she had just attracted the personal attention of the most dangerous being in the galaxy. And from the way Krathver's jaw tightened slightly, even he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a death sentence. The quarters assigned to Krathver at the Imperial Palace were luxurious by any standard, but Sarah could feel the invisible chains that bound them there. Guards stood at every corridor junction, ostensibly for protection but actually for surveillance. The Emperor's invitation to stay at court was as much prison as honor. For 3 days, they waited for the Emperor's next summons. Krathver spent his time reviewing intelligence reports and maintaining correspondence with his fleet commanders, while Sarah remained in her customary position near the wall. But the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. On the 4th morning, the summons came. But instead of the throne room, they were directed to a smaller chamber deep within the palace complex. Sarah had never seen anything like it. The room was filled with three-dimensional maps that showed the entire galaxy in glowing detail. Star systems rotated slowly in miniature, with different colored lights indicating Imperial territory, neutral zones, and enemy holdings. At the center of it all stood Emperor Zakhtar, no longer on his throne but working like a general planning a campaign. "Ah, General. And your human advisor. Come, look at this." They approached the central display, where a cluster of star systems pulsed with angry red light. Sarah recognized the configuration from intelligence briefings aboard Krathver's ship. The Nexari Confederation, Krathver observed. They have been troublesome for years, but never a serious threat, until now. The Emperor manipulated the display with practiced ease, zooming in on specific worlds. They have formed an alliance with 3 other species. More concerning, they have acquired advanced weapons technology from an unknown source. Sarah studied the tactical layout while the 2 Vorthik discussed troop movements and supply lines. Something about the Nexari positioning bothered her, but she couldn't quite identify what. The conventional approach would be a 3-pronged assault, the Emperor continued. Divide their forces and crush them piecemeal. What do you think, General? Krathver analyzed the display with professional intensity. It would work, but at significant cost. The Nexari have excellent defensive positions, and their new allies have added substantial firepower. We might lose entire fleets. Precisely why I wanted fresh eyes on this problem. The Emperor's gaze shifted to Sarah. Human, what do you see? Sarah felt the familiar terror of speaking unbidden in the presence of ultimate authority, but she had learned that the Emperor valued honesty over deference, even from a slave. The alliance isn't real, she said quietly. Both Vorthek turned to stare at her. The Emperor's expression was unreadable, while Krathver looked concerned about what might come out of her mouth next. Explain, the Emperor commanded. The positioning of their fleets? They're not integrated. Each species has maintained separate command structures and defensive zones. They're cooperating, but they don't trust each other. Sarah moved to the display, pointing to the gaps between different colored fleet markers. Look at the boundaries between Nexari and Zelkari forces. There's overlap that suggests neither side trusts the other to hold their assigned positions. And here, the Gorian fleet is positioned to retreat toward their own territory rather than support their allies. The Emperor leaned forward with obvious interest. Continue. It's not a true alliance. It's a temporary arrangement born of desperation. If you could create a situation where one member of the alliance benefits from betraying the others, the entire confederation collapses, Krathver finished, understanding dawning in his red eyes. Exactly. Instead of fighting a coordinated enemy, you'd be fighting confused individual forces that don't trust each other. Emperor Zaktar manipulated the display, highlighting communication routes between the allied fleets. The Gorian have always been pragmatic. They joined this alliance because they feared imperial retribution for their previous neutrality. What if they were offered a better deal? Sarah suggested. Amnesty for their previous neutrality, plus preferred trading status, in exchange for intelligence about their allies' battle plans? The Emperor's laugh filled the chamber, but this time it sounded genuinely pleased rather than predatory. Brilliant! General Krathver, your pet continues to surprise me. Over the following hours, they developed a complete strategy based on Sarah's initial observation. Rather than expensive military campaigns, they would use diplomacy, bribery, and carefully orchestrated betrayals to turn the alliance against itself. The Zelkari fear the Nexari more than they fear us, the Emperor noted. If they believed their allies were planning to sacrifice them, leaked intelligence suggesting Nexari plans to abandon Zelkari positions during the first Imperial assault, Sarah suggested. It doesn't have to be true, just believable. Krathver added tactical details to the deception plan, while the Emperor provided political context about each species' particular fears and ambitions. What had begun as a single strategic insight was evolving into a comprehensive campaign of psychological warfare. As the planning session concluded, Sarah realized something had fundamentally changed. For the past several hours, she had been treated as an equal participant rather than a slave offering suggestions. The Emperor had asked for her opinions and incorporated her ideas without hesitation. Excellent work, the Emperor said as they prepared to leave. Both of you. General, implement the preliminary phases immediately. I want Gorian representatives contacted within the week. As they walked back through the palace corridors, Sarah noticed that Krathver seemed troubled despite the successful planning session. What's wrong? She asked quietly. You have gained the Emperor's attention, he replied. That is both a blessing and a curse. He values your mind, but he also sees you as a useful tool. Tools are discarded when they are no longer needed. They entered their quarters to find an unexpected visitor waiting. Duchess Valthara rose from an ornate chair, her predatory smile even more pronounced than before. "General, how fortuitous! I was just admiring your accommodations." Her golden eyes fixed on Sarah, "and hoping we might continue our previous conversation about your charming pet." "The human remains with me," Crathver replied firmly. Of course. But surely you understand that the Emperor's favor can be fickle. It would be wise to have friends who might offer protection when circumstances change." The threat was barely veiled. Sarah understood that Duchess Valthara was offering to shelter her from imperial displeasure in exchange for ownership. The fact that such shelter would likely involve torture and eventual death was merely a detail. "I will consider your counsel," Crathver said diplomatically. "Excellent. Oh, and there's one more thing." The Duchess moved closer to Sarah, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Enjoy your current status, little human. All empires fall, and when this one does, your imperial protectors won't be able to save you from those who remember what your species has cost us." With that pleasant thought, she glided from the room, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfumes and implied menace. What did she mean? Sarah asked. "What has my species cost the Empire?" Crathver was quiet for a long moment. "There are things you do not know about the war between humans and the Empire. Things that might change how you see your situation here. Tell me." "Later, when we are somewhere more private. The palace has many ears, and some truths are dangerous to speak aloud." That evening, as they prepared for sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change again. She had gained the Emperor's favor, which was both protection and danger. She had attracted the hostile attention of a powerful noble who saw her as prey, most concerning of all. She was beginning to learn that her role in this galactic drama was larger than she had ever imagined. The casual comment about costs to the Empire suggested that Earth's relationship with the Vorthek was more complex than simple conquest. As she settled onto her sleeping mat, Sarah made a mental note to press Crathver for answers tomorrow. Whatever truths he was hiding, she needed to understand them if she was going to survive the deadly games of the imperial court. Outside their quarters, palace guards maintained their watch, ensuring that the Emperor's newest asset remained safe and secure. But in the shadows beyond their sight, other forces were beginning to move. Forces that saw a human girl at the heart of imperial power as either an opportunity or a threat that needed to be eliminated. The assassination attempt came at dawn on their 7th day at the Imperial Palace. Sarah woke to the sound of energy weapons firing in the corridor. Outside their quarters, Crathver was already moving, pulling on his armor with practiced efficiency while issuing commands to his personal guard through his communication device. "Stay down and stay quiet," he ordered Sarah as explosions rocked the walls. "This ends now, one way or another." Through the reinforced door, Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of Vorthik Imperial guards engaging with attackers. The harsh buzz of energy weapons mixed with the deeper roar of plasma grenades. Someone was making a serious attempt to reach their quarters. Crathver checked his weapons and moved toward the door. "If they breach this room, hide behind the furniture and do not try to be heroic. You are no use to anyone dead." Before Sarah could respond, the door exploded inward in a shower of metal fragments. 3 figures in stealth armor rolled through the opening, their weapons already tracking toward targets. Crathver met them with the fury that had earned him his reputation. The general moved like a force of nature, his massive frame belying the speed and precision of his attacks. The first assassin managed one shot before Crathver's claws opened his throat. The second lasted long enough to realize he was facing the Emperor's Volf before plasma. Fire ended his existence. The third assassin, however, had not come for Crathver. Sarah saw the energy weapon swing toward her and dove behind an ornate table just as the blast scorched the air where her head had been. The assassin advanced with professional calm, apparently unconcerned that his companions were dead. "Nothing personal, human," he said through his helmet speakers. But your existence has become inconvenient for certain parties. Sarah scrambled backward as another energy blast turned the table into smoking debris. She was trapped with nowhere to run and no weapons to defend herself. The assassin took his time, knowing that his prey was helpless. Then Krathvor's roar filled the room like the sound of an avalanche. The general crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, moving faster than something his size should have been able to move. The assassin spun to face this new threat, but he was far too slow. Krathvor's claws passed through the assassin's armor like it was paper. The would-be killer collapsed without another sound, his weapon clattering across the floor. "Are you injured?" Krathvor demanded, turning to check on Sarah. "I'm fine. Just terrified." Sarah's voice shook despite her attempt to remain calm. "Who were they? Professional killers?" "Expensive ones." Krathvor examined the bodies while Imperial guards secured the area. "Their equipment is top grade, which means someone with serious resources wanted you dead." Emperor Zaktar arrived 30 minutes later, his personal guard forming a protective barrier around him as he surveyed the damage. His red eyes took in every detail with cold calculation. 3 dead assassins, General. Your reputation remains intact." The Emperor's tone was conversational, but Sarah could sense the deadly intelligence working behind his calm exterior. "The question is who sent them and why." "The target was clearly the human, Your Majesty. They made no attempt to engage me until I interfered." "Yes, I noticed that detail." The Emperor's gaze fixed on Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. "It seems someone considers you dangerous, little human. Dangerous enough to risk Imperial displeasure by attacking you in my own palace." Sarah found her voice despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "I'm just a slave, Your Majesty. I don't understand why anyone would see me as a threat." "Don't you?" The Emperor's smile held no warmth. "You have advised the Empire's most successful general. You have offered strategic counsel that saved thousands of Imperial lives. You have gained the personal attention of the Emperor himself. Some might consider that quite threatening indeed." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. By trying to be useful, by attempting to survive through intelligence rather than submission, she had made herself a target for anyone who saw human influence in the Empire as dangerous. "The Duchess?" Krathvor suggested. "Possibly. But Valthara prefers more subtle methods. This has the feel of someone desperate enough to risk direct confrontation." The Emperor gestured to his guards. "Increase security around General Krathvor's quarters, and begin investigating recent communications from the outer territories." As the Emperor departed with his entourage, Sarah realized that her brief moment of safety was over. Someone wanted her dead badly enough to attack her in the heart of Imperial power. The only question was whether that someone was inside the palace or operating from outside. Later that evening, with additional guards posted at their door and electronic surveillance monitoring every approach to their quarters, Krathvor finally told Sarah the truth about humanity's war with the Empire. "Your species fought us for 7 years, he began, settling into his chair while Sarah sat cross-legged on her sleeping mat. "But it was not a simple conquest as I previously implied." "What do you mean?" "We expected to crush humanity within months. You had no significant space fleet, no advanced weapons, no alien allies. By every calculation, Earth should have fallen in the first assault." Sarah felt a chill of premonition. "But it didn't." "No, your species did something we had never encountered before. You refused to surrender even when defeat was certain. You fought from your cities, your mountains, your oceans. When we destroyed your military, you became guerrillas. When we occupied your territories, you became saboteurs." Krathvor's red eyes held a distant look, as if he was remembering battles from long ago. "We learned to fear human determination. A human soldier might be weaker than a Vorthek warrior, but he would fight with broken bones and empty weapons. A human civilian might flee from our armies, but she would return at night to plant explosives in our supply lines." "You make us sound heroic," Sarah said softly. "Heroic. Terrifying, often both at the same time." Krathvor leaned forward. "We won the war, but it cost us more than any previous conquest. Entire fleets were destroyed. Planets were so thoroughly devastated that they remain uninhabitable. The Emperor himself nearly died when human commandos infiltrated the Imperial flagship. Sarah stared at him in shock. Humans nearly killed the Emperor? They did kill his predecessor. Emperor Malthor died when human fighters crashed their ships into the bridge of his dreadnought. That is when Zaktar took the throne and made the decision to end the war through negotiation rather than continued violence. The revelation left Sarah speechless. She had assumed that Earth's defeat had been swift and decisive, another world falling before Imperial might. The reality was far more complex. The peace treaty granted Earth autonomy in exchange for cessation of hostilities, Crathver continued. But many in the Empire see humanity as an ongoing threat. They point to human tactical innovations, human stubbornness, human unpredictability as evidence that your species will never truly submit. Is that why someone wants me dead? Because I represent human influence in the Empire? Partially. But there is more. Crathver's expression grew grave. The Emperor is old, even by Vorthak standards. When he dies, there will be a succession struggle. Different factions are already positioning themselves for the coming war. What does that have to do with me? You have become a symbol? A human who advises imperial strategy, who influences major decisions, who has gained the personal favor of the Emperor. Some see you as proof that humans can be valuable allies. Others see you as evidence that human contamination has reached the highest levels of government. Sarah began to understand the true nature of her situation. She wasn't just a slave who had caught the attention of powerful people. She was an unwitting player in a galactic political drama that could determine the future of human-Vorthak relations. So what happens now? She asked. Now we discover who sent those assassins. And we prepare for the possibility that tonight's attack was only the beginning. As if summoned by his words, the communication device on Crathver's desk chimed with an incoming priority message. He activated the display, revealing the face of Commander Thay Canol aboard the General's flagship. General, we have received disturbing intelligence from our agents in the Outer Rim. Admiral Kexthu has declared open rebellion against the Emperor. He claims that human influence has corrupted the imperial government and must be purged. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. Admiral Kexthu commanded one of the Empire's largest fleets. If he was rebelling specifically against human influence, she had just become the most wanted fugitive in the galaxy. How many ships has he taken with him? Crathver asked. 47 vessels of the line, General. He's calling it the Purification Fleet. The general's scarred face remained calm, but Sarah could see the calculations running behind his red eyes. 47 warships represented a significant military force, enough to threaten entire star systems. Set course for the capital immediately, Crathver ordered. Maximum speed? As the transmission ended, Sarah realized that her simple existence had just sparked what might become a civil war. The fragile human girl who had only wanted to survive was about to discover just how much her voice could shake. The foundations of an empire? The rebellion Admiral Kexthu called the Purification Fleet struck 3 Imperial supply depots before the capital even learned of his defection. His strategy was brutally simple. Demonstrate that human influence had made the Empire weak by defeating Imperial forces using traditional Vorthak tactics. Sarah stood in the Imperial War Room, no longer relegated to the wall but positioned at the central planning table beside Crathver and the Emperor's other senior commanders. The transition from slave to strategic advisor had happened so quickly that she sometimes felt dizzy when she realized where she was. Standing, Kexthu has captured the Helios sector, reported General Morgan, his scaled fingers dancing across the tactical display. His fleet is moving toward the industrial worlds. If he takes the shipyards... he can build his own dreadnoughts, Emperor Zaktar finished grimly. We cannot allow him to establish an independent power base. Sarah studied the three-dimensional map showing fleet movements across Imperial space. Red markers indicated Kexthu's forces, while blue showed loyal Imperial units moving to intercept. But something about the rebel admiral's strategy bothered her. Your Majesty, she said quietly, Admiral Kexthu is moving too fast. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Despite months at court, Sarah still felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. But the Emperor had made it clear that her insights were valued, even if others found her participation disturbing. "Explain," the Emperor commanded. "He's capturing territory but not consolidating his gains. Look at his movement pattern." Sarah traced the rebel fleet's path on the display. "He's leaving minimal forces to hold each captured system." That suggests either extreme confidence or ... or what? Krathver prompted. "Or he's not planning to hold territory. He's planning something else entirely." The Emperor leaned forward with obvious interest. "Continue your analysis." Sarah manipulated the display, highlighting communication routes and supply lines. What if the captured systems aren't his objective? What if they're just bait to draw Imperial forces away from something else? "The capital," General Morgan breathed. "He's trying to lure our fleets into chasing him while he prepares to strike at Vorthak Prime." Emperor Zakhtar's red eyes blazed with sudden understanding. "A decapitation strike. Take the throne world and the rebellion becomes a revolution." The room erupted in controlled chaos as the assembled commanders began issuing new orders. If Kexthu was planning to attack the capital directly, every available ship would need to be recalled for defense. But that would mean abandoning the outer systems to rebel control. "We cannot leave the industrial worlds undefended," General Morgan protested. If we don't pull back our forces, there won't be an empire to defend," Krathver interrupted. "The humans' analysis is sound. Kexthu is gambling everything on one decisive strike. Gambling on the assumption that human influence has made us predictable," the Emperor added with deadly calm. "He expects us to defend territory methodically while he moves freely, a traditionally Vorthak approach." Sarah felt a moment of inspiration as the pieces fell into place. What if we gave him what he expects, but not the way he expects it? The room fell silent as everyone waited for her to elaborate. "Admiral Kexthu chose rebellion because he believes human influence has corrupted Imperial strategy. He thinks we've abandoned Vorthak military traditions in favor of subtle human approaches. And?" the Emperor prompted. "So we show him that humans can think like Vorthak when necessary. We give him the direct confrontation he wants, but on our terms instead of his." Sarah moved to the tactical display, her hands shaking slightly as she outlined her proposal. "We recall the border fleets as he expects, but instead of positioning them defensively around the capital, we use them as bait. Let him think he's achieved surprise, then spring the trap when he commits to his attack." Emperor Zakhtar studied the battle plan with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "You propose to sacrifice the outer systems to ensure victory at the capital." "Temporarily. Once Admiral Kexthu is defeated, the rebel forces in those systems will surrender or scatter. But if he takes the capital, the rebellion spreads across the entire empire." The strategic discussion continued for hours, with senior commanders adding details to what became known as the Capital Gambit. Sarah found herself contributing tactical elements that drew on both human military history and Vorthak traditions, creating a hybrid strategy that neither species would have developed alone. As the planning concluded, Emperor Zakhtar dismissed his other advisors but gestured for Sarah and Krathver to remain. "An interesting plan," he said once they were alone. "But it relies heavily on Admiral Kexthu behaving as we predict." "All strategies involve risk, Your Majesty," Sarah replied. "But Admiral Kexthu has spent his entire career fighting predictable enemies. He's never faced an opponent who could think like both human and Vorthak." "Indeed. Which brings me to a crucial point." The Emperor's gaze intensified. "If this plan succeeds, it will prove that human-Vorthak cooperation produces superior results. If it fails, it will vindicate every argument Kexthu has made about human corruption." Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had gone from slave to strategic advisor, but now the future of her entire species might depend on whether her plan succeeded. "I understand, Your Majesty." "Good, because there is one more element to consider." The Emperor activated a private communication channel. "Admiral Kexthu is not the only threat we face. The holographic display showed intelligence reports from across Imperial space. Duchess Valthara had been conducting secret negotiations with several noble houses. 3 Outer Rim governors had declared neutrality rather than supporting either side. Most concerning, human colonies in Imperial space were reporting increased raids by unknown attackers. Civil war attracts opportunists, Crathver observed. Everyone sees a chance to advance their position. Precisely. Which is why victory must be absolute and decisive. We cannot afford a prolonged conflict that gives our enemies time to organize. The battle for the future of the Vorthek Empire began 6 days later when Admiral Kexthu-S fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the capital system. 47 warships arranged themselves in traditional attack formation, their weapons already charging for the assault on the surface of Vorthek Prime. Sarah stood in the Imperial Command Center watching the tactical displays that showed every ship, every weapon, every movement in the space around their world. The plan they had developed was about to face its ultimate test. Kexthu is transmitting, reported the communications officer. Put it through, the Emperor commanded. Admiral Kexthu-S image appeared on the main screen, his scarred features twisted with righteous anger. Emperor Zaktar, your reign of weakness and corruption ends today. The Empire will be purified of human contamination, beginning with the execution of that creature you keep as a pet advisor. Admiral, the Emperor replied with calm authority, you are guilty of treason, rebellion, and poor tactical judgment. Surrender now and face only execution. Continue your attack and face annihilation. We shall see whose judgment proves superior. Kexthu-S image vanished as his fleet began its final approach. Sarah watched the enemy formation advance with growing tension. Everything depended on Kexthu committing fully to his attack before he realized the trap they had prepared. If he detected the hidden Imperial fleets too early. Contact, the tactical officer announced. Enemy fleet engaging outer defense platforms. The battle had begun. Now they would discover whether a human girl's voice had been strong enough to save an empire, or whether her influence would be remembered as the catalyst for its destruction. As the first explosions bloomed in the darkness of space, Sarah realized that, regardless of the outcome, she was no longer just a fragile human girl. She had become something new, a bridge between species, a translator of military thought, a voice that could make the Emperor's most savage Volf not just listen, but bow to the wisdom she offered. The final test would determine whether that voice could roar loud enough to shake the galaxy itself.